I've fallen in love with the Union County Heritage Museum. Yeah, I mean, Fred's a retired museum professional. And so, we've spent a lot of time during our lives in museums, and we love it when we find a user-friendly, welcoming, inviting museum. And I think this is one. We've been so impressed with it. When we were here a couple of months ago, there's a steady stream of local people in here for this and that reason. And then yesterday, I met all kinds of people coming in here, and now tonight, y'all are here. So congratulations on having not just a fine collection and exhibits, but a place where, we know, Fred and I know, that it's sometimes challenging to get folks to go to a museum. But y'all seem to have, I know with Jill's leadership and contributions from all of you, you've made this a very friendly, welcoming place. So congratulations on that. And again, I'm honored to be here. First of all, in terms of an overview of this, I think of these quilts, all of them, as landscapes, whether they are referencing the physical, geographical landscape or the literary landscape. They're all about landscape. Now, I make other quilts too. I make outer space quilts. I've been lately all hung up on outer space, and I've made all these COVID quilts, but these maps get more attention than anything, and I love them, and I love making them. And the story quilts have been getting a lot of attention too, and I thought they were pertinent to where we are, So that's part of the, I also want to tell you this. I'm a Southerner. My family's been in the South since there has been a South. I'm also a Georgian, and my family's been in Georgia since before there was a Georgia. So you're going to see all of these works in this room, every single work in this room is Southern. And I'm not opposed to doing pieces that reference somewhere else, but I'm drawn to what I know and what I love, and so most of my work is Southern. Somebody the other day asked me, have you ever made a Yankee quilt? I think I made one or two. I had a show in Maine, and I made one or two, and I had a hard time. But anyway, these are Southern quilts. I'm also a Georgian, as I said, and so the majority of quilts here are Georgian, but I made two special quilts of Mississippi for this show, and they're right back here. One is Mississippi counties, and one is the river system of Mississippi. So I made those especially for this show, and I want to make sure you see them. I have a funny story to tell you. You see the Mississippi county one, and it has the blue on the side. Well, I posted that on social media the other day, and somebody wrote me a note and said, is that the Mississippi River? I felt like saying, what do you think it is? Is it an oil slick? I don't know. Can you imagine not knowing on the west side of Mississippi, that is the Mississippi River? But anyway, it is Mississippi River. And those are the Mississippi counties. And back there, near that corner, is Elvis Presley Lake in Tupelo. So those are three Mississippi maps that are in here. There's some Alabama maps in here. There's a South Carolina map in here. And some Georgia maps in here. And then, of course, these are all my Faulkner story quilts. And then these are story quilts of other Southern literature. I taught Southern literature for 28 years, and so when I retired 11 years ago and started really, full-time quilting, I couldn't leave the literature. So I started making these literary quilts. And I didn't realize until yesterday that everything that's not Faulkner is a Southern woman writer. There's Flannery O'Connor and Carson McCullers and Alice Walker over there, and Harper Lee. So that's just a general overview of this exhibit. Okay, now, y'all ready for me to talk about this quilt? Zoom into this bad boy? Okay. In 1717, this Scotsman by the name of Sir Robert Montgomery was given by a British holding company this huge chunk of land in what was to become later the colony of Georgia. Now, this was 1717, so it was a few years before Georgia became a colony. And the Scotsman was given this huge chunk of land between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers. So it's in southeast Georgia, at that time in the wilderness, occupied by Indians and Frenchmen, who of course were not very friendly with the British. But in 1717, this Scotsman was given this chunk of land, and he saw an opportunity. So he either drew this map himself or he had it drawn. He had it printed and published in these brochures that were circulated around Great Britain. He was trying to appeal to people to invest in this development, his idea for this development. Now, his plan is this. Let me go into some detail about the plan, because this is where it gets to be really interesting. This is 20 miles by 20 miles in the wilderness. 20 miles by 20 miles, so it's 400 square miles in the wilderness. His plan was that in the center, there's this big house where the boss man lives. The head guy lives in this big house in the middle with these formal gardens surrounding the big house. These squares here are each supposed to be 1 square mile, and that's where the landed gentry live. They're the ones who invest in this. These are the ones who buy the 1 square mile lots and invest in all this. These are 4 great parks for these landed gentry folks to enjoy. Out here are orchards and gardens, and if you look carefully, you'll see some little cabins scattered around, and that's where the indentured servants lived, and they're the ones who were to tend the gardens and the orchards. They also were to work the row crops, which are out here. They also, and I'm still talking about the indentured servants, they were to man the cannons that were on the 20, 40, 60, 80 miles of fortifications that were to be built by the indentured servants. So that was the plan. It never came to fruition. I don't think anybody wanted to come out here in the middle of nowhere and live surrounded by French and Indians. There are other reasons why it might not have come to fruition, but this was the plan. If you look at it long enough and think about it, you'll notice that there's some essentials to a community that are not on here. There's no room for shops and churches and schools. There's no room for any of that. And there's no water. There's no creeks or rivers. Now, it's his development plan, so maybe he just left that off knowing that there would be, in a 400 square mile area, there would be creeks and rivers. But this never came to fruition. He also, Sir Robert Montgomery, fell out of favor with British Parliament for some reason or other. So I don't know if they took the land back or what, but this never came to fruition. The map, and there are copies of it in various rare books libraries around the South. The copy that I've looked at and referenced is in the Hargret Rare Books Library and the Richard Russell Library at UGA. And it's a little old bitty thing, only about that big. But this map has been called the first visual depiction of American westward expansion. Now, I don't know if that's really true, but if you Google the Margravate of Azilia, you will find that descriptor of it. Now, I first heard about the Margravate of Azilia when I was in 3rd grade Georgia history. When I was growing up in Georgia, we had a real megadose of Georgia history. And since my dad's family's been in Georgia so long, and the family has an interest in Georgia history, I heard about the Margravate from early on. And I was fascinated with the concept. It was taught to me as something that promoted Georgia as this land of milk and honey where everything was fertile and growing. I was an adult before I realized it was just some guy's development plan. He wanted to make a buck. It took me a long time to realize that, but I love the way my 3rd grade teacher said, the Margravate of Azilia. And then my school buddies, after we got to high school, we used that phrase in a funny way. If things ever got tough, somebody would say, oh, I just wish I was in the Margravate of Azilia. So for a long time, I wanted to make the quilt, and I finally, about 3 years ago, I'd been thinking about how to do it. So I finally decided, and at that point, I wanted a long-term project. I wanted something that would take me 2 or 3 years to complete. I'd made a lot of short-term things, but I really wanted something to hang with for 2 or 3 years. And so I started the Margravate, and I finished it in 9 months, the same time it takes to have a baby. And I just had a really good time making it. Everything went the way I planned. I had a couple of little glitches. I made one whole section of houses upside down and had to turn them around. But I had great fun making this quilt. And it's been exhibited a few places, but I'm really happy that it's here today. And at the end of this, I'll have time for questions, and you may have some questions about the margrave. Oh, I might tell you that margrave and margrave come from a Spanish word that means kind of like boss man, master. Azalea, nobody knows what azalea is. It always reminded me of azalea, so I thought that maybe it was, having to do with the greenness, the flora in the region. I don't know, and some people also say, this map reminds them of the plan for Savannah. We'll realize that it was only a few short years later that James Oglethorpe presented the plan for Savannah. James Oglethorpe was very much in good stead with British Parliament. In fact, I think he was a member of Parliament, so he, really was able to develop the plan that's similar in some respects, not totally, but similar to this. But we'll have time for questions at the end. I now want to call your attention to the quilt right behind Steve over there, and Fred is going to be my laser pointer. Have y'all met Fred, my husband? That's Fred. And this is a map of the Chattahoochee River right south of where we live. We live in Columbus, Georgia, and the Chattahoochee divides Alabama from Georgia for much of its way. Right here it does. So that's Georgia on the right and Alabama on the left, with what I deem the most dramatic curve in the Chattahoochee River. The Chattahoochee is not very curvaceous, not like Alabama rivers or Mississippi rivers. It kind of just starts off right there and goes straight down, but there is that one curve called Snake Shoals. And I decided I wanted to quilt that curve for no other reason than that curve exists, and to me is beautiful. But then when I started digging in, I realized there's all this history. That is a 9 square mile section of that part of the country, 3 miles by 3 miles. It's actually 3 miles one way by 2.9 the other way, but anyway, it's essentially 9 square miles. And the history, let me tell you a little bit about the history. This area was, of course, originally settled by Muskogee Creeks. Y'all are Chickasaw territory here, right? Chickasaw here? And we are Muskogee Creek territory. So this was occupied by Muskogee Creeks. In 1690, Fred, in 1690, the Spaniards came in. Fred's a historian, so he knows all this. The Spaniards came in and built Fort Apalachicola right there. This was the northernmost part of Spanish Florida at that time. And of course, Georgia was not Georgia yet. But the Spaniards built that fort there. It only lasted 1 year. I guess they didn't like hanging out with the Muskogee Creeks, I don't know, but the fort was only occupied for 1 year. Archaeologists have now, thoroughly studied that site, and there's nothing left for an ordinary person to see, but it was there. And then in the 1820s, when European settlers, ancestors of folks like us, moved in, this man by the name of James Boykin, who has relatives all over our part of the country in Alabama, James Boykin, and he happens to be the great-great-great-grandfather of a real good friend of mine, and she's one of the reasons I became so interested in this piece of land. She was out there kayaking up and down the river looking at her ancestral homeland, and I said, well, that's the very place I've been looking at. So anyway, that was part of my inspiration. But her ancestor owned, I don't know how many acres, and had a big old cotton plantation there, all in the floodplain. That was in the 1820s, all in the floodplain. So fast forward to the 1930s, and the Irish Catholics set up a mission right up there called Holy Trinity, a Catholic mission, and it still exists to this day. Now, later in the 1940s, Fort Benning came real close to all this, but it's not quite on the map. I almost wish I'd made the map bigger so I would have had that little bit of history in it, but it doesn't quite reach there, but it's real close. But those are the true topographical lines. You can sit down, Fred, unless there's something you want to point out. Is there anything you want to point out? Those are the real topographical contour lines. So, they're real dense on the lower right. That means that, of course, there's bluffs. There's real steep bluffs going down to the river, and they're less dense at some other places. And all those, Fred, point to the floodplain. Sorry. And my cotton rows. Yeah. So we had all this flat stuff there that had no contour lines, and yet those of you who quilt know that you can't have a quilt with a bunch of space that's not quilted. It just won't hang right. You got to quilt it. So I kept thinking. What can I do? What can I do? And finally I thought, well, my friend Rachel's great-great-great-granddaddy had it all plowed up. So I hand quilted rows, rows of cotton, crops. And I didn't know which direction. I'm not enough of a farmer to know which direction to run the rows, so I consulted a farm historian, and he wrote me a treatise. The guy wrote me a treatise telling me when over time the philosophy had been run them this way, and when over time the philosophy had been running them parallel to the river. And anyway, I decided I could run them any way I wanted to. So I hand quilted. I love to put some hand quilting on. I used to be an exclusive hand quilter, and I moved to machine quilting a number of years ago. But I still love to put some hand quilting on a work. So my rows are hand quilted, and that was great fun. And I've actually made 3 versions of that. This is actually my favorite of the 3. I make once a year a piece of one of these map quilts for one of the river conservation organizations. We have the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, we have the Chattahoochee River Conservancy, there's Wild Cumberland down on the coast. So once a year I make a piece and donate to them to promote their preservation efforts. And I made one in green that was raffled off for the Chattahoochee River Conservancy that was the first one I made. And then I made my friend Rachel one, a little one. Well, it's not little, but it's smaller than that. So I love that spot, and I really had fun making that quilt. And so that's that one. Now the last, I want to speak about these over here, the story quilts. And I have to say, Fred is good for more than just pointing. I can't draw very well. I have trouble drawing a stick figure. I can trace, I can think, I can do a lot of other things, but I can sew, but I don't draw very well. So Fred gets full credit. He gets half credit on all of these story quilts. I mentioned that I taught Southern literature for 20, did I say that? I taught Southern literature for 28 years, and when I retired, I could not leave the literature. It was so important to me, I couldn't leave it. And I knew I wanted to make some quilts that addressed Southern literature. So the first thought, I love As I Lay Dying. I love the novel As I Lay Dying. And my first thought was to make an As I Lay Dying quilt. It was actually suggested to me by one of my teaching friends. And I said, that's it, that's what I got to do. So the first thing we did was that I made, and Fred assisted me in making a big quilt that was 14 panels, all about As I Lay Dying. Now, it's sold, and it went to a wonderful home. I'm so thrilled with where it went. But after it left, I missed those panels. I missed Addie. I missed Cash. I missed, Dewey Dale. So I decided I'd save most of those drawings that Fred had done for the big quilt. So I took those drawings and made these 5, and then another one of Addie on her deathbed, and it lives in a home in Oxford. But anyway, we made the individual panels into individual quilts. Now let me tell you a little bit about how we work, because I think it's interesting. We went into this kind of not knowing how to do this, how to collaborate, and I came up with the method. Fred's not one to, plan things in detail ahead of time. He kind of is more spontaneous than I am. But anyway, here's how we did it. We each reread and each refamiliarized ourselves with the work. And each of us made 2 lists. Each of us made a list of the most powerful images in the book, the images that really appeal to us, each one of us. And then each of us also made a list of phrases out of the book that we thought were important to use. I really wanted some text on these. So Fred has his list of images and phrases. I have my list of images and phrases, and we compare them, and we see how much matchup there is. And of course, there's a lot of matchup. And then, we each have veto power. So if there's something that I really want done, and Fred says, I don't want to draw that, that's cool. And if there's something that Fred draws and I don't like it, that's cool too. I think I had him draw at least 5 grandmothers from Flannery O'Connor's The Good Man Is Hard to Find before he got to the grandmother that I wanted. But that's how we kind of go about it. Now, it's become, our method was real sort of strict in the beginning, and now that we've made a bunch, it's become a little more, a little less structured. We don't have to do quite as much, this way. And we don't even have fights over it. I really, when Jill contacted me initially, I thought, well, I really want to show the Faulkner quilts here, and I'm really thrilled that they're here. These, I mentioned them already, but I was director of the Carson McCullers Center. Carson McCullers is from Columbus, and she was born there and raised there, and she's my girl. I was director of the Carson McCullers Center for Writers and Musicians for 12 years, and I taught McCullers, and I know a lot about McCullers, and so the Frankie on front there with the Mexican hat on, that's Frankie Adams from Carson McCullers, the member of the wedding. So that's a quilt that's particularly important to me personally. And I like Fred's drawing there. I think I'm open to questions if y'all have questions or comments.
Talk about the one in the very corner where the 2 ladies are holding the quilt.
Oh yeah, the one in the very corner. Oh, that's one of my very favorite short stories in the whole world. It's Alice Walker's Everyday Use. It's a story about 2 sisters. Alice Walker grew up near Eatonton, Georgia, out in the country, and her family didn't have much. But she, of course, went off and became very educated and very famous and, very intellectual. And so I feel like the story is to an extent autobiographical. I don't know that it's completely autobiographical, but it hints at autobiography. But the story is about these 2 sisters. One, Maggie, on the right, the skinny one, has never left home. She's not become educated. She was injured in a house fire and is very shy and withdrawn because of that. But she knows how to quilt, and she has made quilts. Well, the one on the left, Dee, who I think is the Alice Walker, character, Dee has left home and gone to New York and become hip and she's seen quilts on walls in museums. So these quilts she had never thought anything about. She decides she wants to come home and get them and take them back to New York and put on the wall. The mama, who's no dummy, has to decide which daughter gets the quilts. Now, I'm not going to tell you who she decides on. But I tell everybody when I'm pointing to this quilt, there are 9 quilts on that thing, and I made every one of them. But the other thing I wanted to tell you is that Alice Walker herself is a quilter. She's a great quilter. And there's this interview with her in a book called Communion of the Spirits by our good friend Roland Freeman. And in that interview, Alice talks about how her quilting informs her writing. She has like a quilt that she was making when she was writing Color Purple, a quilt she was making when she was writing other works. So quilting has been a very important part of Alice Walker's life, so I was very happy. What made me start thinking, I wish I'd brought the passage, but the very opening paragraph of that short story, Everyday Use, it opens with the description of the yard, the swept yard, the sandy swept yard, and many of us will remember when yards used to be swept. The sand used to be swept in patterns, And as I read that, I thought, that sounds like quilting lines. Alice Walker's so great at imagery. So, the swept yard to me said quilting lines, and that's when I knew I had to make that quilt. So, and Fred, we worked hard on those drawings, and I think Fred did a good job, particularly with Maggie, but that's that quilt. Anything else? Yes?
Will you talk about the one that says it's an outrage with the eagle or
It's
vulture?
buzzards. Yeah, vultures. Yeah, well, in As I Lay Dying, Addie Bundren dies in the beginning of the book. She's on her deathbed right at the beginning, and she dies, and so her family loads her in this wagon and drags her all over Mississippi, going to bury her near her family's. That's what the daddy tells them they're taking her to bury her at her family's home place. Well, it takes them a long time. The river floods and they can't cross the river and they get delayed. Well, she's in the coffin and it's been some time and she's not embalmed. So things get kind of, Well, her little son, who doesn't understand death, has drilled holes in her coffin for her to breathe. He doesn't understand. So things get a little rank. And at one point, the buzzards start flying around, and this neighbor woman says, "Ooh, it's an outrage, it's an outrage." So it's a scene in the book. Yeah. The quilt that's not here, the one that lives in Oxford, I really love it, but it sold to this person in Oxford. And it's about the size of her in her coffin, but it's her on a deathbed. And I made a quilt to go on her, a quilt within the quilt. The little quilt has pieces about the size of my thumbnail on it, and it covers up Addie while she's on her deathbed. And I have a funny story about that. The man who bought it is an attorney, and he has a second home in Oxford, and the quilt hangs in his second home. His first office is in D.C., but his second home is in Oxford. And during COVID, my son-in-law, Will Cook, runs Southside Gallery in Oxford on the square. Oh, I meant to tell y'all that a long time ago. That both our kids, I skipped that. I knew I skipped something. Both our kids went to Ole Miss and graduated from Ole Miss, and one of them just stayed and stayed. She's been here 22 years now in Oxford and Water Valley. And so Fred and I feel like part-time Mississippians, because we come out here to see the kids and the grandkids. Our son graduated from Ole Miss too, and he was out here for about 10 years. He eventually went somewhere else, but North Carolina. But we do feel like we're part-time Mississippians. But anyway, Will, my son-in-law, sold that quilt, and he is in communication with the guy who bought it. It was during COVID, and the owner told him, he said, I had this hanging behind my desk in my office in my home in Oxford, and I was doing all these Zoom calls. And he said, I kept getting questions about that quilt. And I thought, I bet you did. This woman is lying on her deathbed. But I thought that was funny that thought it was surprising that he got questions about a woman on her deathbed. But I was just thrilled that he bought the quilt, because he's a good home too. Yes, Jay.
All right, Cathy. Howdy toddy.
Howdy toddy, yeah.
Well, welcome and thank you for Fred and Cathy to come and share your creativity with us. I am intrigued with how husband and wife collaborate, and you give him half credit for some of the works over here. So I'm going to ask you the question, and you may choose whether or not to answer it depending on how much friction it will cause your marriage.
All right, I'm ready.
So these are scenes from book.
Yes.
All right? And you're the quilter. You're the one who is actually going to make it happen.
Right. Fred does drawings, then I do the fabric pulls.
Exactly. But then there is this creativity involved in which you are looking at what to show, what to portray, how the wings will be, how the gun will be pointed. So that creative process between two artists who are both creative, how does the back and forth happen, and how do you guys go step by step?
That's good. That's a good question.
That's my question.
And Fred's a painter, and we collaborate. We live in a cotton mill loft, and everything's pretty open. There are a couple of rooms that are sort of rooms, but they're open at the top. So there's a real free flow of, in the space we live. We have studios there, and our kitchen is there and our bedroom is there. It's all, sort of one big space. And I'm forever calling Fred into my studio area and saying, Fred, what do you think about this? How's the composition for this? Do you think this ought to be here or there? And Fred's forever calling me over to his little studio space, his easel, and saying, how do you like this? So it's just a constant, swap, whether we're working on these quilts or not. But yeah, I mean, we really, Jay, I appreciate that question, but we look at things like how the gun is pointed. We have long conversations about that kind of thing. In fact, that very thing on that quilt, we really talked about a lot. And because, we want to do honor to the literature. We want to keep the intent of the writer. And I hope, I know our pieces are a little cartoony, and I hope we're not making fun. But I think even though a lot of this literature is essentially sad, and a lot of people think of it as sad, there's great humor in it. I mean, there's great humor in Faulkner. There's great humor in all of them. So I hope that we're addressing the humor in a respectful way, because we certainly don't want to do anything else. We don't want to be disrespectful to the literature. And I know that we're holding close to the to the real content of the literature. But thanks. Yes?
How did you do something of that scale? Do you use a long arm quilt?
No, I don't have a long arm. I have the simplest machine in the world. I have a straight stitch machine. It just knows not even a zigzag. Now, I do have another machine that has a zigzag, and I every now and then use it, but most everything is done on my straight stitch Juki 210Q. It's a heavy duty machine. It's all metal. I tell everybody, if I tried to sew through a car tire, I think it would. I never have tried it, but it sews through. You've probably noticed I work primarily on canvas. I like the way canvas looks. I think it looks a little more, it's got more heft, I think the maps look good, and it's got a little more gravitas than Kona cotton. Now, I'll use Kona cotton on a lot of things, like the story quilts, but on the map quilts, I use a lot of canvas, so I need something that's going to handle that canvas, and my Juki does it. But every now and then, I use the zigzag. Like sometimes on the edges of the rivers, I zigzag them down. But that's, and my Juki it's just a regular machine, but it has an 11-inch heart space. No, 9. 11, 9. Anyway, it's a pretty big heart space, and it sits up high. It's like 6 inches off the table. I mean, that way. So I can get that under the Juki. But I'm good at. I don't roll it up. I work in puddles. That works better for me. But it's called.
Like on that one, did you start in the middle and work out, or?
Not exactly. Oh, but I did do this. Just a second. It's one piece to a certain point. 14 inches. It's right here. Right here, everything from 14 in is one piece, and then 14 out here is a separate piece that I added later. And I didn't have to do that, but I was a little bit worried. I'm trying to remember exactly why I did that. I was a little bit worried that things might go wonky if I work with such a big piece as I'm moving it around. So I thought that I'll do the center, that whole middle bit, and then I will be able to do these 14-inch pieces kind of more easily under the sewing machine and then put them together. So that's what I did. But in retrospect, I didn't really need to do that. Everything was working out fine. But here's what I did do. I drew it off drew all the squares, the little ones, the big ones. I drew all the squares, not the individual plants or any of that. I didn't draw them. But I drew the squares with those turquoise water-soluble pens, and that's how I kept all the hedgerows straight and the lots straight. Now, what I do, it's called free motion quilting. I rig my machine, I drop the feed dogs, and I put the stitch length to 0. and I put the fabric under there and moved the fabric with the needle. You know, it's like it's called free motion quilting, and it's like if you had your pencil suspended and you had a piece of paper underneath it and you were moving your paper to draw. That's exactly what it's like, except you're also got your foot on the pedal of the sewing machine, and that's running the motor, and you are in control of the stitch length. So you have to, you know, you have to coordinate your foot and your hand movement and your direction and all that. It takes some practice to free motion quilt, but once you learn it, I'm addicted. I love free motion quilting, and it's how I did all the topographical lines and everything. It's how I do everything. It's, yeah.
It looks like some of the, when you said that your machine, your Juki, does not have a zigzag, it looks like some of the things were like, say, a decorative stitch.
Okay, 2 of them are.
Oh, okay.
2, did you see the 2 that are?
Well, I don't know. Point to it.
Well, I have to tell you,
I don't know. I'd have to
Fred and I have looked at this quilt, you know, for these several years. It's been in existence, I guess, 3 or so years. And yesterday, Fred found a tree that doesn't have a trunk. So I got to go home and put the trunk on. But yeah, there are 2 of the garden. I bought a zigzag during the time I was making this. I got tired of, it was really hard to come up with different plants and keep them consistent. That was the hardest part, was the gardens and orchards. So I bought a nice zigzag machine thinking, it's got all those stitches, I'll be able to make cabbages and lettuces and all that stuff. I made 2 little gardens. This one, and this one. And I didn't like the way they looked. And I put that machine aside and made everything else free motion. And yeah, my cabbages are not the same size in the same garden, but they wouldn't be in real life anyway. Right. But I guess I got busted on that. Huh?
So the cannons on the outside of the
yeah.
perimeter,
Yeah.
do you do the stitching and then you did the cannons after you had done the outline of the...
Yes. And I used a nickel for the big cannons, for the wheel on the big cannons. I used a nickel to draw. And then for the little ones, I used the cap of one of my marking pens. That was fun. And real fun part was the formal gardens. I made little cardboard cutouts that I drew around for the formal gardens, and I still have those. I kept any of the templates I made for this just for keepsakes. But I had real fun with the formal gardens. But I did make one whole section of the houses upside down, and I didn't notice it. And one of my sisters, I have 3 sisters, and they love to monitor what I do. So one of them came in and said, Cathy, you have a whole section of houses upside down. So I didn't have to redo the whole house. I just took the roofs off and moved the roofs to the top. So it all worked out. But that's that.
Would you talk a little bit more about a good man is hard to find when we're at that point where they have the gun in hand?
Oh gosh. A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor is one of my favorite short stories. I've taught it 1,000 times. And it's about this trip that this family, this grandmother and her son Bailey, and Bailey's wife and their 2 little kids, John Wesley and June Starr, go on this trip. They're going, you can't exactly, it's kind of like the trip of life. You don't know exactly where you're going. There are all these landmarks and things you pass by, but you don't really know where you're going. Well, they get word, there's a little bit of prophecy going on, and they stop at this barbecue joint and learn that there is a misfit out on the highway. He's been a bad something. He's a bad something. And so they don't pay much attention to the prophecy, they just keep on going. Well, they wind up, the prophecy comes true, they run into the misfit. The misfit and his 2 cronies. So that littlest quilt on the far right is the misfit and his 2 cronies. And notice that he's shirtless. And in the book, he's described as being shirtless. He's described as having silver-rimmed glasses. And his 2 cronies have guns. And I love Fred's drawing of the misfit and the cronies. And so I have to tell you that eventually the family has a little wreck because that cat, Pity Sing, the grandmother's just, I always ask my students, describe the grandmother. She's obnoxious. She's obnoxious. But she's also, she's just like all of us, she's hypocritical. She claims to be all ethical and Christian and all this stuff, but she's fallible, like we all are. And but she's really obnoxious, and she's not supposed to have brought the cat, but she's brought the cat. And the cat jumps out of her pocketbook and jumps on Bailey's, her son's, neck and causes a wreck. So the family wrecks. And who comes along but the misfit and his cronies? So the misfit takes each of the family members off in the bushes and shoots them and kills them. And the grandmother is the last one, and she, how do I describe it? She makes connection with the misfit right before he kills her. She experiences grace. She says, "You are one of my children." Flannery O'Connor's all about theology. She's all about sin and atonement and grace. So this is a grandmother going through all this. And the misfit shoots the grandmother, and then the misfit says she'd have been a good woman if there'd been somebody there to shoot her every day of her life. Because she did, right at the end, she got it together. But the shirt is Bailey, her son, had worn this shirt. It's described as a yellow shirt with blue parrots on it. Well, after the misfit takes Bailey off in the bushes to shoot him, the misfit comes back with Bailey's shirt on. And that's how we, the reader, know what's happened in the bushes. So when we started working on this piece, I knew that I had, and I know our misfit looks different. That's the same. The guy with the Hawaiian shirt is the misfit who's over here looking different. We know that. But we made those at two radically different times, and it's okay if your vision of a fictional character changes, right? But so I started looking for a Hawaiian shirt that was yellow with a blue parrot. I really wanted it to be yellow with a blue parrot. I could not find one. I could find blue shirts with yellow parrots. I could find red shirts with blue parrots. I could find every combination except yellow shirt with blue parrots. And finally, after about 3 years, and I was looking for fabric or shirts, and finally, after years of looking, one day there it was when I Googled yellow shirt with blue parrots. So I said, Fred, I finally found it, a yellow shirt with blue parrots. And Fred said, order 2, I want one. So sometimes when I talk about that quilt, Fred will wear the shirt, but I'm not too wild about him looking like a misfit. So I said, don't wear it this time. But, and the cat. I'd made this gray cat, and I wasn't crazy about the gray cat. And I have this really good friend in Ireland, and she happened to post on her social media a picture of her cat, who is this incredible looking white cat. I mean, my rendition does not do her real cat. Her real cat is just this incredible looking white cat. So I wrote her, I said, Rebecca, can I use your cat in my piece? And she said, oh yeah. So that's an Irish cat right there.
So how do you find fabric for all these stories?
Oh, they're just ordinary fabrics. I mean, from all over, I buy a lot of fabric at Joann's. I order online. My daughter Coulter has a studio in Water Valley, and people bring her. She just takes any kind of cast-off fabric from anywhere. So every now and then I'll ask her if she has something that might fit my needs. But most of my fabric that I use is readily available. I do some hand dyeing, like the misfit and his cronies. Almost everything in there except the denim is hand dyed. The red dirt is hand dyed, and yeah. Yes, Steve. What?
This gentleman, Mike.
Oh, Mike.
He's been fighting all of you women trying to get his hand.
I'm so sorry.
It's really more of a Fred question, I think. In Georgia, the gnat line, that's a thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it moves around.
Not much.
I was thinking about that first Spanish fort of Chattahoochee. Would it have fallen above or below the gnat line?
Oh, above.
Yeah.
Above the gnat line.
Yeah. The gnat line, I come from real close to the gnat line. The gnat line is between my hometown of Buena Vista, Georgia, and America's. Oh, it's right close to Plains. My town is 11 miles from Plains, and the gnat line is between Buena Vista and Plains.
Georgia Southern, that's below.
Georgia Southwestern.
Georgia Southern.
Statesboro's in Georgia Southern, and that is down in Nat territory. I went to school at Georgia Southwestern in Americus one summer. The gnats were so bad they called off classes. But the gnats truly are below, right above Americus, below Buena Vista, right at Plains.
The first thing I thought of when Fred was pointing that out was, where does that fall in relation to?
Yeah, that's above the gnat line. Not far, though.
You should do a gnat line quilt.
That's the second time somebody said that in the last week. Somebody suggested that. Maybe I need to do that.
What is the gnat line?
There are these little insects called gnats that will, you know what a gnat is, and there's a certain point in Georgia where below that point, gnats are just in profusion. I mean, everybody, you'll know if you're talking to the people down there know they do like this when they're talking. I mean, they have to, it's funny. Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of jokes about the gnat line. People have tried to invent hats with flaps like this, that keep the gnats away. But the gnat line's a real thing. Yes?
How many quilts do you have going at one time?
That's a good question. Back when I worked and I was just quilting every afternoon, when I taught, I taught high school for 14 and a half years, and then I taught university level. But when I taught high school, to decompress, I would come in the afternoon, and if I could steal an hour from the family, I would plop down in front of Court TV and watch Court TV and hand quilt. And I started naming my quilts for the trials. I made the Menendez Brothers trial, and I made the Betty Broderick trial, and I made this huge O.J. Simpson quilt trial. And the quilts themselves had nothing to do with the content. It was just what I was working on while I was watching such and such trial. But back then, when I didn't have much time, I just did one quilt at a time. I was determined to finish a quilt, and I would work on one quilt at a time. But now that I have time, I work on several at a time. I might have 4 or so going at the same time. Because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but one is sometimes I'm waiting for materials. I might have ordered something and it's not there yet. But a lot of the time I just want to put something on my design wall and have it up there and be thinking about it. Because I have decisions to make about it. So I want to look at it and think about it and let it percolate. And sometimes I get tired of, just physically tired. Like, sometimes if I've been quilting too long, my neck hurts. And so I've got to leave that alone for a while and do something else. But I really like a balance between handwork, because even on these that are machine made, they have some handwork on them, like the facings and hanging apparatus and all that. But I like to have some handwork going, and I like to have some machine work going. And I also I get up real early in the morning and start work too early. And so I like to have something going that's quiet so I won't wake up the neighborhood with the sewing machine. So all those are factors as to what I'm working on, but I'll have 4 or so going at the same time. Anything else?
Do you ever do any feast quilts?
Yeah, I do. Not often. I started off doing that. The O.J. Simpson quilt was a piece quilt.
Okay.
It was a Jacob's Ladder. I started off for the first half of my quilting life. I started quilting when I was 19, and until I retired, just about the time I retired in 2011, I made exclusively traditional pieced quilts. But then I really wanted to branch out and make things that weren't that were not somebody else's pattern. And so I started, with some inspiration from my daughter, I started making quilts that were unique unto themselves, and quilts that were made for hanging instead of putting on the bed. But I'll still jump back and make one. Particularly, I have a bunch of nieces and nephews, so when they have babies, I make them baby quilts. That's fun. I like doing that every now and then. Okay, yeah.
When you sell your quilts, how do you recommend that they're displayed?
I usually work with the person and ask them about what their walls are, and that's a good question. Hanging a quilt challenging. And I usually talk to them about where they're going to put it, and we look at the quilt, and I'm constantly learning better how to hang quilt. That every quilter has trouble, I think, with that. But I just look at it and work with them and try to figure out the best way. It's hard when I have quilts that I carry around and display different places, because I was telling Jill yesterday, some galleries now have these special hanging things that have to have, everywhere's different. So it's hard to have pieces that, if I were going to install any one of these in somebody's home where it was going to stay there, I could figure out what works best for that space. But these are, some of them I prepared for one space and then I had to change it. So anyway, that's always a challenge.
Do they typically just hang open like this, or are they encased?
Typically hang open like this. You'll notice that some quilts I stretch on stretcher bars. Those are stretched. And I really love the way stretched ones look. Yeah, and I'm tempted to go to stretching everything. I'm really tempted to take all my story quilts and attach them to stretched canvas, a black stretched canvas that barely shows around the edge. I've done that with I do flowers, and I've done that with some of my big flowers. But some people don't want them stretched. Some people, and they also cost more if you're going to ship them. It costs way more to ship one of those than to roll up one and ship it. So all those are factors when somebody buys one, because sometimes people who buy them are nowhere near me. But I'm tempted to put these on stretcher bars. But that's another, I'm glad you brought that up, because I like the way they look stretched, but some people want them looking, they say they look more like textiles if they're not stretched, and some people want them that way. Well, y'all, it's been a pleasure. I brought some of my cards. I'm on social media. I got a website, and I got a Facebook and an Instagram page. So if y'all want to check me out there, if you want one of our cards, my email's on there. But this has truly been a pleasure. Thank y'all so much. Thank y'all.